Hey everyone, happy to have another Smarter Science of Slim bonus podcast this week. And actually, really excited to talk with a guy who has a special place in my heart. His name is Ben Greenfield, just an awesome podcaster and blogger. But even more importantly than that, someone who supported the Smarter Science of Slim back in the early days. Actually, Ben recorded a podcast with me, the first ever podcast I recorded, even a year before the Smarter Science of Slim came out. So Ben saw something that he liked and was there to support. So wanted to give Ben a shout out here and provide any support we can now for him. So Ben, how you doing today?
Good. Way back in the dinosaur days, huh, man?
Totally. I feel like we were communicating via the strings with the cans on either end, and now we have Skype. I mean, what is...
Yeah, technology has come a long ways. My computer no longer fills up my entire office. It's this small portal sitting on my desk. It's crazy.
Well, speaking of technology, one thing that I know you've had a lot of personal success with and that I get a lot of questions about, and I was hoping you could tell us about, is performance. Specifically, I'd like to focus on endurance performance without eating a bunch of starches and sweets. Because Ben, you know that we hear this traditional dogma of carbo loading, and it's really just synonymous with endurance performance. And I haven't studied endurance performance too much, but I know you have a lot of experience there. So could you just give us your take on the avoidance of starches and sweets when it comes to endurance and sort of triathlon-like performance?
Yeah, sure. The concept of consuming carbohydrates as a primary fuel while you're out running a marathon or doing a long bike ride is based off the idea of hitting the wall. And you've probably heard of that, right, Jonathan?
Absolutely.
Yeah, bonking. And, it's a pretty crappy place to be for anybody it's happened to. But basically, that's when your body completely runs out of storage carbohydrate, meaning that you've got two kind of primary places where you store carbohydrate, your liver and your muscles. And once you deplete all of that carbohydrate, which typically takes about 2 hours or so of moderate aerobic exercise, you start to get dizzy and weak and lightheaded, and your performance suffers. And so the answer to that, especially back in the marathoning days of the 80s and on forward even to today, is that you eat a higher carbohydrate diet. So you always have your liver glycogen stores and your muscle glycogen stores topped off, and that works. You will be able to perform pretty well when you're keeping your glycogen levels topped off. But there's a health trade-off, meaning that when you're constantly elevating your blood sugar levels through consumption of Gatorade and Sunny D and gels and sports drinks and energy bars and energy chews and bagels and pasta, you throw your blood sugar levels up, and that can contribute to net inflammation. It can cause a net drop in pH, so increased acidity. There can be basically fermenting in the gut that leads to things like yeast overgrowth or irritable bowel syndrome or heartburn. And essentially what you're doing is you're training your body to rely upon a fuel that it really relies upon best when it needs to run from a lion. In reality, you can use fatty acids quite efficiently as a fuel, and you only need trace amounts of carbohydrate coming in, much less than we've been trained to rely upon in a marathon or in a triathlon.
Oh, that's just fascinating, Ben. And I'm curious, what is the theory? I mean, just there's got to be, what I've found, at least, talking about, for example, calories in, calories out, is it's not crazy. It's not like saying 1 + 1 = green cheese. Like, it's more of a misrepresentation of the truth. And is there any, like, what is, or maybe it is just nonsense, what is the idea or the theory behind a high consumption of carbohydrate and starches and sweets? We're not talking, no one's like, oh, just eat a bunch of broccoli before you go run a marathon. They're talking about eating starches and sweets and these gels and synthetic foods that you mentioned. What's the idea of doing that 24 hours beforehand? What is the concept?
Yeah,
behind that.
and that relates to something you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, carbo loading. And carbo loading is the idea that you can not really trick your body, but you can scientifically upregulate the activity of the enzyme that's responsible for taking carbohydrate and pulling it into muscle and, well, mostly muscle, not really liver. But what you can do is you can upregulate the activity of that enzyme. It's called glycogen synthase. And the idea behind carbohydrate loading is that you kind of deplete the body for a few days, maybe a week or so before your race, and then during that entire week, you gradually load up with incrementally greater amounts of carbohydrate until you're eating a 85 to 90% carbohydrate diet by the day before your big event, your marathon or triathlon or whatever the case may be. And by doing so, you can get your body to store up to 60% additional storage carbohydrate. Now, all of the studies that have been done on people who carbo-loaded were performed in folks who were eating a typical Western diet. They weren't performed on people who were, say, for example, eating a low-carb, high-fat diet, or who were very, very efficient at using fatty acids as a fuel. But nonetheless, you can tweak your body so that you can store more carbohydrates leading up to the race. The problem is that if we're looking at this from a scenario of wanting the body to be in a state of fatty utilization, or fatty acid utilization anyways, does it really make sense to do that carbo loading scenario? Do you really need all that extra carbohydrate on board? And what I've found is that by eating a lower carbohydrate, higher fat diet, year round, and for just the last day or two leading up to, say, a long event. We're talking about something that lasts longer than 3 hours. But when you're in that last day before a long event, on that one day, you tweak your diet towards a little bit higher inclusion of safe starches, like sweet potato, yam, white rice, taro, things of that nature. And then you basically avoid that entire carbohydrate loading scenario, which, especially if you're doing lots of events during a year, if you're really into marathons or something like that, can really wreak havoc on your body. So what it comes down to is that carbo loading can elevate your body's muscle glycogen stores, but it makes the assumption that that's actually necessary, that you have to be relying on all that carbohydrate during the event, when it makes more sense to rely on your body's practically infinite stores of fats rather than its limited stores of carbs. And when you rely on your fat during an event, you're just bleeding into that carbohydrate storage in very, very small amounts. So you don't bonk, and you don't get to that point where you're running out of energy because you're using relatively high amounts of fats.
So Ben, is my understanding correct? What I hear you saying is it's not that the carb approach doesn't work. It's that there is another approach which is actually more sustainable and may have less negative health consequences.
Yeah, it comes down to two things. The first thing is health versus performance. So are you willing to sacrifice your overall health and possibly even your lifespan, your risk of diabetes, obesity, things of that nature, for the sake of the performance that you could get with a higher carbohydrate intake? And the other aspect that you have to look at this from is from kind of an ancestral or an evolutionary standpoint. For anybody who hunts or who hikes out in the wilderness, if you look around you, you see a lot of low starch sources, plants, vegetables, roots, things like that. You see some proteins and some fats and animal sources, but there's not a lot of readily available carbohydrate sources. There's not a lot of fruit hanging from all the trees and things of that nature everywhere you go. And so we have a very decent ability as humans to be able to rely on a large amount of fatty acids as a fuel with trace amounts of carbohydrate here and there. And we can go for long periods of time doing that. It's just a matter of training the body how to do it. So yeah.
And it sounds like what I heard you say there is that there is a trade-off in terms of, and the science is pretty clear, that eating starches and sweets, regardless of what it does for your performance, is obviously not good for your health. So it seems pretty clear that taking a saner, as I would call it, approach to endurance performance is certainly better for your health. But is there any, is it, are they both good and they both equate to the same amount of performance, or is taking these gel packs and ingesting all these starches and sweets, almost like steroids, where it does actually perform better, but it's killing you. Or are they about the same?
Yeah, sugar is a sometimes drug. I don't know if you've heard that saying before, but there is a little bit of a paradox there, where if you really want to, let's say, you're a pretty serious athlete and you're going to go out and you're going to run a marathon hard. You're going to be tapping into a lot of fast twitch muscle, which uses a lot of carbohydrate. And even if you're a fat adapted type of person and you've been watching your carbohydrate intake for your lifestyle fueling, you're still going to need some source of sugar going into your body during that event, because let's face it, that's not natural. The first person that ran a marathon died. So in a way, you almost have to do something unnatural to your body from a nutrition standpoint during something like that to get that fast acting octane fuel. And for me, when I'm, because I do a lot of Ironman triathlon, when I was making the switch to becoming aware of what sugar can do to your body, and for me it really started with my gut, just horrible gut issues, bloating and fermenting and all sorts of stuff with higher carbohydrate intake. I had to figure out something that I could do. And so for me it's come down to tweaking what would be traditional endurance fuels, sports gels, sports drinks, things of that nature. And basically when you look at this from a very, very practical standpoint, what I look for are very long chain molecular weight carbohydrates that take a long time to digest. So either trying to eat real food sources during my training, or even using engineered fuels, like there's one called super starch that I use during an event, and also relying on amino acids and fats, things like coconut oil and medium chain triglyceride oil, and amino acids powders, which can actually keep your intensity elevated without creating a lot of the blood sugar fluctuation that sugar does. So, it certainly is very, very easy to maintain that performance when you have high amounts of sugar coming in. You got to go out of your way to find engineered fuels or alternative fuels that let you achieve that same level of performance, but it's completely doable if you kind of know where to look and you train your body how to digest these things during intense exercise.
And it sounds like if you do choose to use these unnatural sources of calories to achieve unnatural levels of performance, which makes sense, right? If you want to do something unnatural, you might need to do something unnatural. It sounds like we still need to be careful where we look. Anecdotal example, I was shocked. I'm not a huge fan of quote unquote food manufacturers, as I know you are not a fan as well, but I was shocked to look at, I went to the store the other day and I had some time on my hands and I looked at a Powerade bottle and I was like, I'm just actually curious, what is actually in Powerade? And I was shocked. It is sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. Like, I thought at least it would have glucose in it or something that would actually be helpful from a performance perspective, but ingesting high fructose corn syrup as your sports fuel, that's got to just be one of the worst options available.
Yeah, and you know what? The issue is not even quite so much what you hear people talk about with fructose and with sugar, spiking the insulin levels and spiking the blood sugar levels when you're consuming that during exercise, for example, because your body is fairly insulin sensitive, and let's face it, a lot of that is getting burnt as a fuel source. But the issue is the net acidic condition that can create in your body as you amp up your carbohydrate levels. And the other issue is that it tends to create a lot of gut fermentation and a lot of yeast and fungus and issues, and feeds bacteria in the stomach. And so that's one thing, is during exercise, it's really not the blood sugar fluctuation as much as it is some of the other side effects of sweet carbohydrates. But the sad thing is all the folks who are just walking around, the street drinking Powerade, or the kids who are sitting in school drinking Powerade. That's kind of the sad thing, is that, this goes way deeper than just, what people are consuming during exercise. These in exercise fuels that are kind of bad enough for you when you're out there racing, have kind of weaseled their way into everyday life with a quote unquote health stamp on them, and they're creating a lot worse health effects just in everyday life than they are out there in the sports arenas.
Oh, absolutely. And I was just shocked to see the choice of a high fructose corn syrup just simply because the fructose's absence of impact on insulin, and how when you are exercising, getting some glucose, hypothetically, if you could run an IV of glucose into your bloodstream while you're exercising, I'm sure that would enhance your performance. So, but I was just shocked because, Powerade, the thing which is supposed to be designed to optimize your performance, even that manufactured food is not manufactured in a way that would optimize your performance. So even there, you got to be buyer beware.
Yeah, to a certain extent, and I may disagree with you slightly on that, just based off of some of the research that has come out in terms of mixes of fuels. The reason that they'd include something like fructose in some fuels is that they'll mix it with like a long chain molecular carbohydrate like maltodextrin. When you have like a fructose maltodextrin blend, you actually get enhanced carbohydrate utilization because both those sugars use different sugar transporters in the gut. But even Powerade isn't doing a very good job of that because I think all they have is fructose. They don't even include a long molecular weight carbohydrate or even glucose or anything like that in there. So I think
exactly
for them it's just a margins issue. They're running it as a business and choosing the cheapest sugar available.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. Where absolutely that diversity, and you mentioned some supplements that I think have worked really well for you, and that's very intentional and it's a very almost pharmaceutical. Here, I really think it's a margins issue, and that's what's got me disturbed. So, yeah. Well, and speaking of just your personal experience, can you tell me a little bit about? I mean, I know you're not just talking about this and you're not just researching this, you do this, you live this. Can you tell us a little bit about your transition from the traditional must-eat high carb to perform well in endurance performance, primarily using starches and sweets, to taking a more, let's call it, sane approach?
Yeah, I mean, I would typically, during an Ironman, I take 9.5 to 10 hours to do an Ironman triathlon, and during that period of time, I'll usually consume right around 40 sports gels, fructose maltodextrin blends, along with a few energy bars here and there, and essentially the equivalent of some gummy bears thrown in. And usually quite a few cups of Coke, too, during the marathon. So by the time that I finish a race, I feel like I've destroyed my internal biology, literally. I lay awake till 4 a.m. with the feet twitching, and the next 3 to 4 days is typically a lot of gas, a lot of bloating, a lot of diarrhea, nasty things like that. And then 5 to 7 days later, you come down with the flu or the cold, and a big part of that is the havoc that metabolizing that much sugar can do to your body. Sure, beating your body up during an Ironman triathlon is gonna make you feel a little bit crappy no matter what, but as I began to research and looking into the research, of people like Jeff Volek and Steve Finney and some of these doctors out there and researchers who are looking into ways to fuel the body without putting that much carbohydrate into the body, I started to experiment with alternative fuel sources. With using trail mix and using real food, and even using just like rice bars wrapped in aluminum foil with some bacon, and just things like this during my training session. And then like I mentioned, started using like longer molecular weight carbohydrates when I did have to really go out there for a long time, like super starch, or using some coconut oil, or medium chain triglyceride oil. And I experimented with this stuff in my training, and I noticed after a big weekend training session, I felt good that night. I just had a glass of wine and dinner with my wife, and I wasn't, I don't want to be crude, I wasn't farting, and didn't have all that nasty, side effect of dumping all that carbohydrate into the body, heartburn, nothing like that. So eventually last year, I decided to pull the trigger and just do it in a race, which is kind of nerve-wracking because you're wondering, am I going to bonk? Because you never quite push as hard in training as you do during a race. So I actually ended up full-on experimenting with a mix of amino acids and super starch, ate half as many carbohydrates as I would normally, chose a carbohydrate source that was released very, very slowly into the bloodstream, and forced my body to tap into its own fatty acids. And I raced Leadman down in Bend, Oregon, which is, I believe it was about a 5-hour event. And I won it and felt great and slept like a baby that night and felt great the next few days as well. So at that point I was like, okay, this is it. And you know what? I haven't had a bad race since, and knock on wood, But yeah, that for me was kind of seeing the light and making that transition, and I'm very, very happy I did, because I'll probably, I'm 31. I'll probably continue to do triathlons for another decade, and now I know that I'm not going to be at least destroying my metabolism and my gut in doing so.
I love that. I love not having to choose between health and performance. And it sounds like you found a wonderful balance there. So that's just a great message. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And Ben, tell me what's happening now for you? What's going on in your world? What are you up to?
Well, I am headed down to San Francisco this week to go to a what's called a biohacking event down there, which should be interesting, and doing some speaking at conferences over the spring. And typically for me, triathlon season ramps up around April or May, and I actually have been spending quite a bit of time putting together a live event in my own backyard. It's called Become Superhuman. And it's kind of been my dream to at some point bring a lot of, for example, my podcast listeners and people who want to find out more about their bodies and their minds, to be able to come together and learn this stuff in a really, really cool setting. So I've put together a live event in Spokane, Washington, and it's designed for anybody who wants to figure out the healthiest and the most efficient way to get a better body, but also to enhance their physical performance, to enhance their mental performance, to fix their gut, to cut through a lot of nutrition confusion, and to basically live longer with a lot higher quality of life. So I've put together a big lineup of speakers from Dr. Phil Maffetone, who a lot of endurance athletes know, to Jimmy Moore, the low-carb guy, is going to come talk about using what's called nutritional ketosis. Monica Reinagel, some people may be familiar with her as the nutrition diva. Ray Cronice, who's a guy who he basically studies how to use cold for enhancing fat loss. Jeff Spencer, who is Lance Armstrong's chiropractic physician and works with a ton of professional cycling teams on enhancing their mental performance and kind of getting into what he calls the champion's mindset. My own personal physician is going to be there speaking. A few other docs from around the country talking about everything from testing your own blood, urine, and saliva and biomarkers to using Chinese herbal medicine to a ton of other stuff. So we've put together a full-on event with after parties and morning workouts, and the goal is for this to be just a really, really special thing for anybody who wants to change their body and their minds for good and come away really, really inspired with all the right connections and the right network to do so. So that's it's March 8th and 9th coming up here in Spokane, and there's still seats to get in. It's $297 to register. So I tried to make it as affordable as possible for folks. And so, people are coming in from all over the world, actually, to come to this thing. So I'm pretty excited.
Oh, I really appreciate you bringing something like that out here to the Pacific Northwest. I haven't heard of too much like that going on, so I'm very happy to hear about that. And what on the web, where could people go to get more information?
So the easiest place to go would be superhumancoach.com. It's superhumancoach.com, and you'll see a little button that says click here, become superhuman, the live event. And if you click there, you'll be able to kind of read up and register. And there's even CEUs for people who are like personal trainers and fitness professionals and things like that to be able to attend. And so, but it's open to the general public as well. So it should be fun.
Oh, it's beautiful, Ben. Well, I love it. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your time and insight with us today. I know this is really, really helpful for me. I'll just point people to this conversation when I hear the questions around endurance performance, and it's just, you just got to eat starches and sweets. It's just what you have to do, and science is showing us, and your personal experience is showing us that that's not the case. So I appreciate you fighting the good fight for us, Ben.
Thanks, Jonathan. And by the way, I'd never heard of you until I got an email from you a few years ago and saw what you were doing. And my first thought was, holy crap, this guy's on top of things. And kudos to you for doing the research and doing the due diligence on a lot of the stuff that you put out. I'm a big fan of your whole Smarter Science of Slim brand and what you're doing. So nice work on that.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate that, brother. Well, hey, have a good next decade of triathlons. I'm sure we'll talk before the next decade.
Yeah, I was going to say, sure, I'll talk to you in 10 years. All right, Jonathan.
Once every 10 years. Hey, thanks so much, Ben. I appreciate it, brother. Have a good one.
All right, thanks.